Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last lecture. Every year, honor seniors vote to choose a professor who had the most impact on the experience as undergraduate students. And this year, it's Professor Diane Detournay. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce her. My name is Elena Nikolenko. I'm Professor of Political Science and Director of the Honors Program. And Dr. Diane Detournay is a Senior Lecturer in English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and the current Director of the American Studies Program. Her current book project explores the institutionalization of feminist politics at the university. And the title of her today's lecture is Feminist Visions of the University, Lessons for Authoritarian Times. Please welcome Dr.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much, all of you. I was trying to think about what to say as my thank you, and it just feels like saying that it means a lot to me is the complete understatement of the century to receive this invitation. And I also just want to say that I know so many of you, and it's been such an honor to share the space with you and to learn from you. And I want to say that what I'm going to share with you all today is the reflection of all of our conversations, and it was made possible in particular by a very special honors literature seminar last year, in which our conversations led me to rethink our relationship to the university. So my own relationship to the university, sorry, so thank you. Okay, so I'm going to deliver a kind of traditional paper, and so here we go. The consolidation of a revanchist, misogynistic, authoritarian regime has been a time of deep reckoning for feminism. Rather than merely taking a defensive posture and denouncing the gendered and sexual politics of fascism from a purported space of purity, feminist scholars have courageously reckoned with the role that certain lineages of feminist politics have played in getting us here. In other words, many of us have questions of complicity, accountability, and the forms of responsibility that emanate from our necessary entanglements with violent power at the forefront of our minds, even while we build our resistance movements and do our best to take care for each other as we are immersed in escalating crises. Since you've chosen me for the last lecture, I imagine you won't be surprised that the focus of my talk is something about feminism, the university, and abolitionist politics. So while this perhaps appears as a niche focus, or what I certainly can't presume are necessarily shared commitments, I want to make the case for what feminism can offer all of us in this moment, a moment in which we're all sorting out what it means to abide by our ethics, to be good people, to live out social justice principles that have been at the heart of your undergraduate education at Fordham. All of this in a landscape that forces us into a scarcity mentality where the choice to protect the limited forms of wealth accumulation available to us do not feel like a choice at all. Long traditions of feminist scholarship, those of you who've taken my classes, have studied these histories, have excavated how feminist and queer politics have fueled imperial projects, campaigns of anti-Black terror, the expansion of the carceral state, and ongoing settler genocide. I'm particularly thinking about pinkwashing in Palestine here. Critically, these bodies of critique don't make the argument that a pure humanitarian and benign feminist politics has gotten wrongly co-opted and weaponized by repressive conservative agendas. Rather, this work traces how feminist investments in protection, punishment, and liberal forms of justice have contributed to the design and expansion of brutal systems of containment, incarceration, surveillance, and genocidal elimination. To take one example, the administration's deadly laser focus on trans women as a source of danger, a threat that demands nothing less than total elimination, laid bare in the slew of executive orders issued by Trump the second he ascended to a second round of office, is baldly cast as a feminist campaign to protect imperiled white womanhood. Here we also see the white supremacist politics, how it anchors itself upon what can only be described as a fundamentally shaky foundation, a binary gender system latched to reproductive heterosexuality. So we clearly need a feminist analysis to defeat fascism. A direct through line can be drawn between the state's assumed role as a paternal caregiver that animates Trump's misogynistic attacks and a particular strain of liberal feminist politics that has relentlessly asked the state to protect women from patriarchal violence attributed to racialized subjects. As a recent panel at the Barnard Feminist and Scholar Conference explored in depth, feminist politics can be said to have long courted fascism. And so here we are. So what's my point in saying all of this? I think the kind of feminist labor that is willing to grapple with these difficult entanglements, the willingness to confront the complicities in the politics to which many of us have devoted our lives, is the courageous work that must take place in this moment. More largely, I think this means the willingness to risk our attachments to what we love most. This includes, for me, the university. In focusing my attention on the university, I want to talk about a relationship that brings us together in this room and which we all share. Likely most of you will not pursue a career in the university, though of course the university is never far from our lives. So I hope that pursuing these questions in relation to this specific site can serve as an opportunity to reflect on how we relate to, inhabit, and resist the institutions that also feed and clothe us, or perhaps more urgently, pays our rent and offers very conditional access to healthcare. I think these are critical questions that you may all end up navigating wherever your post-Fordham journey takes you. From one vantage point, feminists have long held a relation of suspicion to the university, understood as a bastion of patriarchal power and a critical site in the reproduction of the capitalist elite. There are many stories to tell about the foundation of women's studies departments, including an origin story that situates San Diego State in 1970 as the first department. The dominant story emphasizes a lineage in the campus-based student movements of the 60s that joined anti-war, anti-racist, feminist, and queer struggles to the demand for the university to make space for our histories, our politics, and our ways of knowing. Indeed, this was the story of women's studies that I was taught was my political inheritance as an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota. There are other stories to tell, however. Early women's studies programs were also meeting points for socialist feminists who saw the university less in terms of an aspirational dream of incorporation and more as a rich site of wealth and resources that could be seized for the socialist revolution. And I think Bennett Reinhardt, who's a master's student at Fordham here, recently gave me the opportunity to revisit this history and the insight that women's studies programs, including the one at San Diego State, were actually conceived as the academic arm of the socialist struggle, primarily. In this version, the university is desirable for its potential to enable political imaginaries that are likely fundamentally incompatible with its own conditions of reproduction. In her essays on the university written during the 1980s, the feminist scholar Adrienne Rich re-envisioned universities as sites for the provision of urgently needed community resources, including rape crisis counseling, food banks, and abortion services. In a time of relentless attacks on the university and scholarly knowledge, it's certainly tempting to defend the academy at all costs. But this may lose sight of the critical work that needs to take place, including grappling with the current formation of higher ed with its life-stultifying student debt and the infiltration of neoliberal economic values into all aspects of our teaching, research, and study. I take my lessons, as always, from Saidiya Hartman. On the occasion of the annual Read Writers of Color talk last year, and I know many of you were there, Saidiya Hartman delivered a lecture at Fordham amid Trump's escalating assault on higher ed. 4 international students had recently received notice that their student visas were suspended without cause. By its very nature, the Read Talk, an endowment that supports the invitation of a prestigious author of color to campus every year, is itself emblematic of the very diversity logics that are the focus of the Trump administration's ire. Against this backdrop, Hartman's choice of talk was nothing less than stunning. Reading from her satirical essay, Crow Jane Makes a Modest Proposal, Hartman offered a stark reminder that DEI is a politics content with, in her words, segregation now and forever. Even more provocatively, Crow Jane poses the administrative grammar of diversity, equity, and inclusion, joined to its commitment to enumerative accountability, as coextensive rather than oppositional to the values of the emergent neo-fascist regime. Against the popular framing of Trumpism as a backlash to multiculturalism, Crow-Jane situates the institutionalized inclusion of minoritarian difference as the foundation for the planned expulsion and extermination of otherness. Following the spirit of Hartman's choice of reading Crow-Jane as the entire apparatus of DEI was buckling and folding, I'm going to turn first to W.E.B. Du Bois and his articulation of the purpose of higher education from a position committed to dismantling white racial power. So I'm just going to give a little bit of background here. I mean, first of all, I want to say that I'm not interested in positioning Du Bois as a feminist figure, or not. I think we can find feminist resources everywhere we look and everywhere we turn. So that's how I'm going to engage with him. And just as a little bit more context, so W.E.B. Du Bois was engaged in a protracted debate about the best model for Black education with Booker T. Washington. Washington was an advocate of the industrial school system, which focused on vocational training in agriculture, carpentry, and mechanical trades as a means of building Black economic autonomy, which he saw as more important than political rights. But as you can guess, this approach ultimately facilitated the funneling of Black people into low-wage and precarious jobs. Okay. So as the project of racial containment that was the industrial school system was increasingly becoming incontrovertible, Du Bois fought to articulate a vision for the Black university that placed the structuring relations of anti-Blackness at its center. In an address titled The Field and Function of the Negro College, Du Bois makes clear that the university reproduces the logics of racial segregation by failing to link disciplinary knowledge to what he called the caste system. All knowledge and study must stem from the problematic of racial power because this is the defining element of Black people's lives. In defending the need for a Black university, Du Bois makes clear that the abstract knowledge dissimulated by the classical universities, Eton and Harrow, Oxford and Cambridge, is predicated upon reproducing the aristocracy, a system of culture for the cultured. Dismissing the reality of economic constraints produces an academy reserved for students with generational wealth and the resources to secure the markers of the, quote, well-bred. In the humanities, we're well versed about the devastation wreaked by the supremacy of economic rationality. Yet for Du Bois, a university mission unbeholden to the economic is baldly complicit with the reproduction of white wealth. In such a way, Du Bois's writings brings to the fore the problematic of the university's relation to the economic for a politics that is attentive to the racial and structural dimensions of power. At the same time, his vision for, quote, a world without wealth, of capital without profit, notably persists in granting cultural knowledge a defining role in world building. It's in poetry that Du Bois ultimately finds the language to articulate a future that cannot yet be grasped within the conditions of the present. Strikingly, Du Bois is resigned to the reality that there may be no end in sight to anti-Black segregation, and that, in his words, no character, address, culture, or desert is going to change it in our day or for centuries to come. His articulation of radical hope is one that perhaps paradoxically accepts the reality of segregation and white supremacy's brutal power to determine the fate of Black people. Entrapped within a white regime whose rigidity defies liberal cliches about overcoming adversity and the prevailing nature of good, Du Bois cites a line from the Jamaican poet Claude McKay as a dream of freedom. If we must die, let it not be like hogs. In McKay's line, the reality of mass death and the ever-present specter of Black elimination shapes but does not exhaust the meaning of freedom. The alternative is not to enact the same violence as the, quote, mad and hungry dogs that hunt and capture Blackness. Rather, Du Bois makes the call to seize the coerced conditions of our segregated life and, above all, to give it unhampered spiritual expression in art and literature. While the promise of full enfranchisement into the American nation has failed, and Du Bois suggests may be a dream worth giving up on, the domain of modern culture persists as one in excess of whiteness. The speech ends with the haunting lines, "And what pray stops us but our dumb caution, our fear, our very sanity? Let us then be insane with courage." A suggestion, it seems, that hegemonic rationality and the reigning regime of common sense, perhaps those very knowledge orders at the heart of the white university, must be transgressed for dreams of Black liberation to emerge. Reading Du Bois from the current crisis in higher education, one which predates the Trump administration's directed attempts to gut academic inquiry, his writings elaborate a set of questions that remain critical sites of struggle. Namely, what is the mission of a university in an anti-Black world? What form of curriculum and mode of teaching is adequate to these conditions? Is the university a potential agent of social transformation, or can only the dedicated Black university be entrusted with the survival of Black life, or as Du Bois puts it, ensuring our physical survival, our spiritual freedom, and our social growth? Can the university be disentangled from the murderous conditions of the American nation? In a society that is racially stratified by wealth, where it is, quote, the determination of the white world to keep the Black world poor and make themselves rich, how do we articulate the purpose of education? Du Bois compellingly offers an engagement with these questions that does not cede the terrain to economic rationality, or in brief, he refuses to see the university as merely an engine of capital accumulation. At the same time, he never lets the economic out of view as he builds his imagining of a university that is accountable to the lived conditions of Black people. Returning to Du Bois in this moment opens the space for thinking the relation of the economic to the cultural outside of the zero-sum logic generated by the reigning order of enumerated accountability. Within this landscape, art and literature quite literally takes away from the ability to secure a living. I'm sure you've all heard that, right? That if you pursue the arts, then you're giving up on, a cozy life. In Du Bois's writings, the domain of culture is the space of freedom that the white order can never fully capture or contain. Faced with the unrelenting nature of anti-Blackness and the harrowing reality of its intractability, Du Bois offers poetry as all that is worth holding on to in the end, an orientation to art as a practice of living within the ever-present specter of death. If the way out of this system demands letting go of fear and letting go of sanity, his final directive to, quote, be insane with courage finds articulation in the literary. To that effect, the 1933 speech concludes with a mysterious stanza of poetry that the associated footnote describes as of unknown origin, but possibly Du Bois's own. The lines are an arresting conclusion to a speech on the Black university. Like a madman's dream, there came one fair, swift flash to me of distances, of streets aflame with joy and agony, and further yet a moonlit sea, and further yet the infinity of wheeling suns and stars. The celestial imaginary of freedom, marked by an expanding horizon filled with infinite galaxies, offers an alternative to the constricted forms of existence to which the white world has relegated Blackness. The specter of mass rebellion, of streets aflame with joy and agony, is definitively not the result of planned rational action, but is tied to madness and arrives as a swift flash. It is the envisioning of a limitless expanse and always, quote, further yet, that creates the opening for a world in upheaval. Poetry is a gateway to this beyond, a language of hope for a universe whose immeasurable beauty, a moonlit sea, and wheeling suns and stars also births the revolution. Published in 1938, at a time that overlaps with Du Bois's lectures on Black education, Virginia Woolf's Three Guineas occupies a place in the feminist canon as a treatise on the patriarchal nature of the university and the impact of women's exclusion from the male-dominated professions. Three Guineas lends itself to my line of inquiry because it immediately lays on the table the question of whether the university is worth desiring at all. Organized in epistolary form, Three Guineas begins by answering an inquiry from an unnamed educated man about how to prevent war. In her letter, Woolf poses university education as primarily complicit with the values of militarized fascism rather than serving as a bastion of enlightened thought. In so doing, Woolf conceptualizes the university as a critical site in the reproduction of state-sanctioned exterminatory violence through its evaluation of social hierarchy, competition, and patriotism, all of which have their share in, quote, encouraging a disposition towards war. Reading Woolf alongside Du Bois highlights their resonating concerns with the death-dealing nature of state power. And I just want to say, despite the similarity, it has to be noted that Woolf does not recognize the state's war on Black people, and her theory of gender requires a disavowal of patriarchy's entanglements with white supremacy. In one of the most compelling moments of the text, Woolf considers a request to donate money to the rebuilding of a women's college. The institutionalized sexism of the period meant that women's colleges were not considered officially part of the university system, and vicious, protracted battles had recently been fought over women's right to be awarded the same titular bachelor's degree. Not unlike Du Bois, Woolf sees the crisis surrounding higher education as the critical opening to call the entire enterprise into question. Indeed, she's ready to consider that it may be time to, quote, buy rags and petrol and Bryant and May's matches and burn the college to the ground. As all the critical studies are variously slated for elimination by the Trump administration, Woolf and Du Bois call upon our present to resist a retreat to defensive possessiveness about the university. Indeed, the crisis provides the opportunity for radical imagining, as Woolf demonstrates by seizing upon the request for financial donations to envision the fundamental transformation of education. In Woolf's provocative articulation of education, the arts of, quote, dominating other people, of ruling, of killing, of acquiring land and capital will be replaced by arts that are accessible to the poor, such as medicine, mathematics, music, painting, and literature. Woolf continues, the college should teach the arts of human intercourse, the art of understanding other people's lives and minds, and the little arts of talk, of dress, of cookery that are allied with them. Through her emphasis on cultivating relationality, Woolf foregrounds the liberal arts as governed by commitments that are incommensurable with the regime of private property, capitalist extraction, and its adjoining logics of disposability. Freedom from material aspirations provides the foundation for a liberated collectivity. If the college were poor, it would have nothing to offer. Competition would be abolished. Musicians, painters, writers would teach here because they would learn. What could be of greater help to a writer than to discuss the art of writing with people who are thinking not of examinations or degrees or of what honor or profit they could make literature given them, but of art itself? This collective gathering around the arts is a space of freedom where hierarchical distinctions have been eliminated, and thus all the different degrees and kinds of mind, body, and soul may work together. It's notable that Woolf locates the complicity of the university with the war machine in the kinds of relationships that it cultivates. Through its pedagogical logics and administrative structure, the university valorizes domination over others. For Woolf, then, disinterring the conditions that produce broad societal complicity with fascism and with state-sanctioned military violence requires getting rid of degrees, lectures, and the canon altogether. All of these examples enact relations of force and submission to authority. Provocatively, Woolf writes that the experimental college must continuously reinvent itself anew and remain oriented towards the potentiality of the future. Quote, it must be built not of carved stone and stained glass, fun given the room we're in, but of some cheap, easily combustible material which does not hoard dust and perpetuate traditions. Genuinely addressing the social conditions of violence requires a willingness to burn it all down and consistently refuse the settled order of things. Critically, the university is no longer a site of enclosure predicated upon logics of accreditation, but a meeting place where people come together out of desire. For quite simply, quote, people who love learning for itself would gladly come there. Harkening back to Du Bois, Woolf imagines and dreams the possibility of freedom upon the ground of the liberal arts. Woolf poses a relation to the arts, one that's driven by desire, passion, and creativity, as another model for collectivity, belonging, and relationality. A university that seizes upon this desire, that is a desire to learn and to create, as the reason for communing, carries the potential to enact collective liberation. I read Woolf and Du Bois today out of curiosity about earlier imaginings of the university that see higher education as playing a role within freedom struggles. Woolf generated a vision for the university as a space of collective gathering and non-transactional exchange that she ultimately suppressed in the name of a commitment to the material realities of women's lives under structural patriarchy. Du Bois and Woolf are both writing in a moment when inclusion within the university was held as an open question rather than a settled imperative for the fulfillment of justice. Du Bois imagined the university as remaking disciplinary knowledge from Blackness as its point of departure, and as offering a world apart from white racial violence through the study of art and literature. Resonating with Du Bois' specter of streets aflame with joy and agony, Woolf also momentarily indulges the path of rags, petrol matches. And the eruption in her text, which is again quickly sort of suppressed, is I think worth quoting in full. She says, "Burn the college to the ground, set fire to the old hypocrisies, let the light of the burning buildings scare the nightingales and incarnadine the willows, and let the daughters of educated men dance around the fire and heap armful upon armful of dead leaves upon the flames, and let their mothers lean from the upper windows and cry, 'Let it blaze, for we have done with this education.'" The Woolf immediately dismisses this incandescent demand for radical transformation as in conflict with fact. The text's otherwise slow and deliberate style of argumentation is jarringly interrupted by the force of a desire to let the university burn. While accommodationist in its conclusion, Woolf's text carries the trace of an alternative relation to the diagnosis of the militaristic patriarchal values that organize academic disciplines. Quite simply, let it blaze. So I could end there, because that's kind of a provocative note to end on, but I want to offer a few last thoughts. Feminist politics teaches us to center care, pleasure, and solidarity in our struggles against authoritarian rule. We have models for that all around us, including ones coming from you, the students. Case in point, the Palestinian encampments brought a beautiful collective world organized around mutual aid into being. Students built and manifested networks of support predicated upon non-transactional forms of care. The Columbia encampment had communal kitchens, free childcare, a lending library, and forums for political education. Relatedly, Minneapolis, my home, recently defeated a large-scale paramilitary invasion in a show of immeasurable courage built upon communities taking care of one another in ways that relentlessly undermined and indeed exploded capitalist logics of relationality. The feminist porn shop became a food kitchen. This form of resistance is terrifying to fascist orders, not the feminist porn shop, but probably that too. But that we will meet each other's needs and redistribute our resources rather than hoard them. As the Minneapolis-based hip-hop artist Dessa quipped, they had AK-47s and night vision goggles, and we fought back with, I'm going to just say it in the hallowed halls here because it's what she said, with motherfucking whistles. In a recently released song, she wisely adds, "That's the problem with the lap of luxury. The lap of luxury can't stand up." And sometimes the most courageous act is to withdraw. As Toshi Reagan reminded attendees of the Barnard Conference, our energies and our knowledge make up these institutions. If they become intolerable or if they stop appreciating us, we take all of that love and energy and we rebuild elsewhere. Nick Mitchell, a critical university studies scholar, reminds us of the resignation letter submitted by the faculty at San Diego State College in 1974, 3 years after the inauguration of the Women's Studies program there. In a pamphlet titled Women's Studies and Socialist Feminism, they write, "The university not only absorbs our struggles, our ideas, but it absorbs us. The incredible paperwork and bureaucracy, the dean's meetings, faculty meetings, space allocations, faculty timesheets, on and on the list goes. All of this works to bog us down into the structure of the university and makes us lose sight of our original struggles and demands. What we really wanted was a women's studies program, wasn't it? After a while, you forgot what you really wanted. You just worked to maintain what you've got." So in closing, I've been finding great comfort in The Faggots and Their Friends Between Revolutions, a 1977 queer manifesto birthed on the cusp of the AIDS crisis. There, Larry Mitchell writes, "There are two things to remember about the coming revolutions. The first is that we will get our asses kicked. The second is that we will win." The question, of course, is how we define the win. The collective defiance on the streets of Minneapolis, the everyday forms of rebellion that manifest in the seizing of joy and pleasure amidst ongoing crises, the refusal to give up even when we don't know if we will, in fact, win. I take all of this as evidence of the revolution. In Daniela Catrillo's dystopic novel Chilco, economies of capitalist extraction and unbridled real estate speculation have created a landscape where sinkholes are literally opening up in the ground and devouring the poor. A Mapuche elder offers the following words of wisdom to the protagonist. "You know they'll never lose, but we'll keep trying anyway. And when you're old like me, at least you can say you are on our side." That's it.